Well, thank you so much, Ed, and thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. It's always a pleasure to be back at Princeton. It's always exciting to see the incredible progress that is being made here in the field of computer science, but frankly in so many fields across the university that benefit from computer science. And of course, it's always exciting to be with Princeton students. There's nothing like a meeting with Princeton students to keep anybody who graduated from here or anywhere else on their toes. So this is just a wonderful time today. I do want to talk about what's going on in the world, and more importantly, what we might expect to see go on in the world as we think about the rise of artificial intelligence. It's something that we've been giving a lot of thought to at Microsoft and really across the tech sector. But we published a book in January. We call it The Future Computed. And unlike a lot of books that just talk about where technology is going or all the good things that technology is going to do, we really focus on the role of artificial intelligence in society. And a big part of what we focused on is what it will mean for jobs and the economy, which is really what I want to talk about this afternoon. But one of the things we really found ourselves concluding as we put this together is that it's really not all that helpful to think about technological change in terms of what's going to happen in a year or 2 years. Indeed, in a way that most people who work in the technology sector perhaps don't typically think about, it really helps to step back and look at periods of 10 or 20 years. And for those of you who are students today, I therefore wanted to pause and spend a moment on what life was like about the time you were born. Because if you go back 20 years, in 1998, and you asked, how did people begin their day? It began with what you see here. There was really nothing digital in the way people began their day. It really began by turning on a television, listening to the radio, reading a paper newspaper, pulling out a calendar. If you had to call somebody, you used an old phone. And if they weren't there, you left them a message on their answering machine. And if you were around in 1998, what you would have found is that perhaps the single most common joke about technology is whether people could look at their VCRs, the things that we put cassette tapes in to record TV shows, and get the thing that just kept flashing 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock to ever change. Because you had to use a controller to change it. And most people said, this is just too complicated. I'll just turn it on when I want. Well, here we are in 2018. And in this image, I think captures the way we live today. I think for many people, the very first thing you reach for when you wake up in the morning is your phone. I mean, increasingly people sleep with it next to their bed. It's not altogether a wise thing to do, but it has become a habit of our time. And even if you've managed to keep it in another room, you probably find yourself very quickly reaching for it or sitting down at a laptop or desktop computer. And that's where you find out what happened in the world. That's where you get the world's news, but interestingly, it's where you get your news, what happened to your friends, your family, on your various social media feeds. And when you think about your day, you look at the calendar on your device. So the real question is, what's life going to be like in 20 years, in 2038? Now, there is no perfect way to know. But I think it's fair to assume that it will probably be grounded in artificial intelligence. We're already living with so-called digital assistants, whether they're Siri or Cortana or Alexa. And we will probably have more than one helping us, just like we turn to more than one person during a day for advice and help on different topics. But instead of just going to a news feed and scrolling and flipping between apps, we're more likely to have a digital assistant who will assemble the information for us, who will tell us about today's weather, who will tell us about the traffic, not for every highway in the area, but just talk to us and tell us what the traffic is like for us. In fact, I think it's altogether possible that 20 years from now, if you're a man and you're shaving, or if you're a woman and you're putting on makeup, you're probably going to have your digital assistant talking to you rather than the radio as you get ready for the day. The real goal, in our view, is to make sure that all of this technology actually helps us, that it amplifies human ingenuity. But when we think about what this is going to do to the way we live our lives, the jobs that will be available, that we'll hold, we think that the best way to start is to think about what artificial intelligence really is. Because we talk about it in the world as if it's one thing. And in some senses it is. It's the ability of machines to take in data, to learn, and to make decisions. But it's also many things. And one way to think about it is some of the big pieces that really do go into artificial intelligence. There's a big part of AI that's really about perception, the ability of computers to have vision. Now, of course, machines have been able to see since people invented cameras. What's different today is that machines can now recognize those images and discern what kinds of things are there, who is there, all of that. That's fundamental to one part of artificial intelligence. And the same goes for speech. The ability of computers to not only understand what is being said, but discern its meaning. And there have been huge steps forward in both of these spaces over the last 10 years, and there will be ongoing improvements in these fields that will be fundamental to advances in AI overall. Now, there is also cognition, the ability to think, to reason. And there are many pieces that go into that, but two that stand out are one related to language, the ability to understand what is spoken or written in one language and translate it into another. Something that Europeans have long been very good at, and we in the United States not so much. Well, the good news is we may all be helped in this space. And similarly, the ability to sift through knowledge, to find patterns, to identify trends and derive insights and even reach conclusions. All of these things are advancing. I sometimes think that in the world today, we read about AI and we expect that there will suddenly be one day when it's all here, all at once. Well, that's not really the way it works. Each piece advances, and we are already living in a world where AI is around us, in pieces, as it progresses. But we don't always stop and think about it. But just to give you a few examples, BMW touts a feature in some of its newest cars called the pedestrian alert. So the car has a camera, the camera is able to recognize a human being, and the car will display that red icon even if it's in the dark of night and the driver doesn't see the pedestrian. The car will beep, the car will even apply its brakes. That is one element of artificial intelligence. Or to take another simple app that you can get on your phone if you like, it's called Steno. You can bring Steno on your phone to a meeting, and it will not only record what is being said, but it will transcribe it, meaning it is understanding human speech. None of these things work with 100% perfection, but guess what? Neither do human beings. So the real test typically for artificial intelligence is not necessarily when will we get to 100%. It's always when does the computer get as good as an average human being, a talented human being, or maybe in an extraordinary circumstance, a Princeton student who's a human being. But it's making progress in all of these areas. Similarly, we're seeing this in language translation. Skype Translator from Microsoft is one of several things where you can speak in one language and then the computer will show the written word in another language. We've now incorporated this into PowerPoint. It is not far-fetched at all now to go to a meeting, or 2 years from now, go to a meeting. You could have people who speak 10 different languages. And instead of seeing a group of translators in the back with earphones, you basically have somebody presenting slides and the computer automatically translating everything so then everybody in their earpiece can understand what is being said in their own language. That's here today. Or for anybody who uses Spotify, Netflix, and iTunes, which I assume means every student on this campus using at least one of the above, we're used to being delivered suggestions for the next TV or movie program we should watch, or the next song that we might want to listen to. All of that's machine learning. It's all based on the computer knowing that we watched something else and appeared to like it. And then it is using machine learning based on the pattern of what other people who have liked that program or song have tended to want to listen to or watch as well. Now, interestingly, all of these things are made possible by two fundamental advances in computing. They are the fundamental engines of innovation for every single thing. They make it all possible. And it is the characteristic of this particular decade. Huge computational power, meaning data centers, coupled with vast amounts of data. We build data centers around the world as a company. So does Amazon, so does Google. The three of us probably build far more data centers than anyone else. Some of these data centers would occupy multiple football fields in space. They have hundreds of thousands of servers. So it means that when people want to do huge computations, they no longer have to build their own data center. They no longer have to get their own rack of huge numbers of servers. They can simply contract for and use what they want and use it when they need it. And similarly, the fundamental engine for all AI, what you quickly appreciate whenever you work with people who are expert in this field, is it's all about the data. And there is nothing like getting more data. In fact, there's almost an insatiable appetite for data, because the more data, the better one can train computers and perfect algorithms. But these two things are going to continue to drive AI forward easily for the next decade and beyond. All of that is very exciting. All of that delivers huge amounts of potential and even promise for the world. But as we said in the book, we really need to step back and recognize that we can't afford to look at this future with uncritical eyes. Technology is always used in good ways and bad. And even when it's used in good ways, it has an impact that people can't necessarily predict. It has indirect effects that are not necessarily intended. And what the world needs to do is grapple with all of this. In the world today, there is perhaps one question above all else as we think about AI. As computers behave more like human beings, what is it going to mean for us? What is it going to mean for real people? We live increasingly in a time when people are starting to recognize these questions. You see Stephen Hawking, you see many people, Elon Musk and others, warning of the future that we are creating. I want to talk about that future. But in some ways, the most important thing I want to say as a preface is a caveat. The truth is, there is no crystal ball. For a long time, I have admired futurists. They can stand up and confidently tell you what the world will look like in 10 years. And if they're wrong in 10 years, you probably won't remember what they said. It's a wonderful job if you can get it. I think more than that, we need to stop and acknowledge at the get-go that it is possible to discern a number of trends, and we can make decisions based on those trends. But there is no such thing as a crystal ball. None of us know with certainty what lies ahead. So how do we predict what's coming? That really is the fundamental question. How do we figure this out? There are many ways, and there's some exciting research going on right here at Princeton. But I want to offer two thoughts, two different analytical approaches, if you will, to think about what may be coming in store for all of us. The first is to learn from the past, to learn from history. Not because it will repeat itself necessarily, but because it provides insights that we can draw on. So one of the great examples that we've been interested in is the transition from horses to automobiles. And there's some fascinating things one can learn from. It starts with this photograph. This is a photograph of what happened in Germany in 1888, in August of 1888. There was this woman, Bertha Benz. You've probably never heard of Bertha Benz, but you've probably heard of her husband, or at least her husband's last name, because Carl Benz invented the first automobile and is reflected in Mercedes-Benz. Well, it turned out that Carl invented the car, and he took it for a drive out in the driveway, and he invited reporters, and no one took any interest at all. They said, this thing's never going anywhere. Well, it was Bertha's dowry that had paid for all of Carl's work. She was not willing to see her investment go down the drain. So on the morning of August 4th, in 1888, and there's a powerful lesson here for both men and women in the room, she got up and left her husband a note while he was still asleep. And she said, I'm taking our 2 sons and I'm taking the car and I'm driving it to my mother's house. Now the good news was she was fully intending to come back, but her mother lived over 70 kilometers away. So the 3 of them got this car moving. They started driving over these dirt roads. They had to stop at pharmacies to get chemicals to keep the car working. Before the day was done, Bertha had used her garter belt to repair the car. But by the time the sun had set, they had reached her mother's house. And the world awakened. The press took an interest. They recognized this has a future. But interestingly, that was in 1888. People were talking about the automobile. Well, here's a photograph taken on Broadway in 1905, almost 2 decades later. But look at that photograph. What you see are street trolleys and horses, and there's not an automobile anywhere. So what it shows you is that people start talking about something before it necessarily explodes. But now look at this next photograph at the exact same location 20 years later, and what you see are automobiles and trolleys and not a single horse. This fellow lost his job. And what it tells us is that sometimes we end up waiting longer than we expect, but once the technology diffuses, it moves very quickly. And it's like a tsunami that takes over and impacts everything. Now, what did that mean for the economy? Well, it turned out that the supply, the number of horses in the country plummeted. What did it mean for jobs? Well, in some ways, you can see it reflected in the number of companies in the United States that were in the business of building carriages to be pulled by horses. In 1890, there were over 13,000 companies in the United States in that business. By 1929, it was less than 100. And what did it mean for jobs? Well, in some ways, it was sort of easy to predict. You think about the jobs that went away, the jobs that involved the care and feeding of horses, the management of horses, the creation of carriages to be pulled by horses, they disappeared. It's not necessarily a surprise. You'd expect that. And similarly, you could look at the new jobs. Well, guess what? A lot of new jobs emerged that had to do with, we'll call it, the care and feeding of automobiles, building them, putting gasoline in them, being a mechanic and repairing them or driving them. That, too, is not altogether surprising. What is more important and I think instructive for our own future is this. There were a lot of indirect economic effects that resulted. Consumer credit is not something that you would say was necessarily inherent in an automobile. But it turned out that consumer credit was, in effect, an invention so that people could buy automobiles. Here was this expensive thing people had to buy. Other than their home, it was the most expensive thing they probably ever would buy. Once Henry Ford invented the Model T and the assembly line, there needed to be consumer credit so people could afford it. A new branch of the financial sector not only gave birth, it exploded. And so there were people who were employed in consumer credit because of the automobile. Another really interesting thing is what happened to the world of advertising. Suddenly people were going by these signs at a speed of 25 or 30 miles per hour. They had to be able to recognize a product and a company immediately. This gave birth to corporate logos. The corporate logos that we see today, or maybe the Princeton logo. Logos were the result, in a way, in an important, indirect way, of the invention of the automobile. So their advertising changed as a result. But it wasn't altogether good news. And the most sobering thing is this. It's what happened that caused the Great Depression. Because in 1932, the US Census Bureau put out a report that basically said that the decline of the horse was one of the main contributing factors of the present economic situation, and it affected the entire country. Well, how could this be? Well, the answer, when you start to think about it and reason through it, becomes clear. In 1905, 25% of all agricultural output in the United States was used to feed horses. As the population of horses declined, farmers were smart. They said, you know what, horses like hay, but people do not. They grew less hay. They shifted their acreage into wheat and corn. And because of the inelastic nature of prices for crops, they overproduced, and the price of those crops plummeted. Once the prices of those crops plummeted, the income of farmers plummeted. And once the income of farmers plummeted, they lost their ability to stay current with their loans to rural banks. The rural banks started to foreclose on the farmers, but they couldn't keep pace. And then rural banks started to fail. And because of the structure of the nation's financial system at the time, the infection in rural banks spread across the country and led to what became a broad financial collapse. In fact, if you think about it, some of the major things that we take for granted today came out of lessons of that experience. Subsidies so that farmers wouldn't produce too many crops, the FDIC and insurance and other things to regulate banks. And what it tells us, I think more than anything, is we need to be prepared. We need to be prepared for the unexpected, and we may need to be agile as we think about what we call on governments and communities to do. Which I think is sobering, because in some ways we don't live in a time of, say, the most agile government in history in terms of how our politics works, regardless of what part of the political spectrum you may be on. But we're going to have to get ready to deal with new things. There's another powerful lesson from history, I think, as we think about jobs. And this is the era that is one that some of us have lived through in this room. It's the one that I first worked on when I became a part of the industry in which I've now worked. Office automation, word processing. Well, it turned out in the 1960s, when this photograph was taken, or even the 1970s or the first half of the 1980s, people wrote things out on pads of paper, and then you gave them to someone else who used a typewriter to type it up. If you were working in an office, that was typically a secretary, and more often than not, it was a woman. If you were a Princeton senior in 1981 and you were dating somebody who would later become your wife, as I did, she wrote it up in longhand and I stayed up all night so I could type the last chapter of her thesis. Things worked very differently. The world today is quite different. We all do our own writing on our own devices. But what is interesting is this: between then and now, there came a point in time when two things happened to jobs relating to IT. The first is there was this change in jobs. Secretarial jobs declined. There became fewer secretaries, and the IT staff was born. Every enterprise, whether it's a company, a government, a university, or typically even a medium-sized business, decided it needed to hire a professional IT staff. But there was a second thing that was interesting as well. Everybody realized that the IT skills were not only for the IT staff. Everybody had to learn how to use these computers. You had to learn how to use a word processing program. And now today we sort of take it for granted that we're going to figure it out along the way. We're going to find a video on YouTube or learn from a friend. But for the first 10 years, there was actually a big increase in employer-led and paid-for training to train employees in this new technology. And as we've looked at the last few years, employer-subsidized training has been falling. This tells us we're probably going to have to get back to more on-the-job training in new technology. But as we think about how work will change, I think there's some important questions for us to think about. One is, what jobs can AI replace? Well, now let's look beyond the history and basically apply a second analytical approach. Let's try to answer this question by thinking about what computers will be able to do well. Vision, speech, language, knowledge. You start to discern jobs that are most likely to be impacted. When you think about it, think about what a radiologist does. A radiologist takes an image and analyzes it. A computer is getting very good at recognizing images, including radiological images, X-rays. You think about driving. Well, driving is really fundamentally about recognizing images visually, analyzing it, and making decisions. And it is because of the computer's ability to do that through AI that people are talking about the impact on jobs for people who are employed to drive vehicles, automobiles, or trucks. Think about what goes on in a call center. It's the ability to understand speech, analyze it, and make a decision. Or think about what happens when you go through a drive-through of a fast food chain. There is somebody on the other end who has a job, who's listening to you and simply entering what you say onto what is, in effect, a computer. It is highly likely, I think, that in the next 5 years, we're going to be driving up in drive-thrus and we're no longer going to be talking to people. We're going to be talking to computers because the speech recognition of the computers is going to be as good or better than people. Now, think about language, the ability to translate from one language to another. Now, I will admit to some degree, this has been on the holy grail for a long time. The notion that computers would, say, replace professional interpreters who do a wonderful job. It's an incredible skill. A year ago, Satya Nadella, our CEO, and I were meeting in Berlin with Chancellor Merkel in her office, and there was an interpreter. And Satya was explaining that computers were going to replace her job. She said, oh, somebody from IBM told me that 20 years ago. I'm still here. It probably will happen, but what it underscores is that it's always hard to know precisely when. But if you look at the progress being made in this area, it's not necessarily something that I would encourage somebody who's 22 years old to go make their future. And when we think about learning, when we think about what goes into, say, inspecting a machine, at Microsoft, we have 3,500 fire extinguishers on our campus. We used to have somebody whose job, we had several people who had the job of inspecting the fire extinguishers every month, and they could tell whether the pressure had fallen and therefore the fire extinguisher needed to be addressed. Well, every one of those 3,500 fire extinguishers is now connected with an IoT, an Internet of Things device, to the network. So whenever the pressure falls below a certain level, we know instantly. And then somebody can go out and fix the fire extinguishers that need to be fixed, but not inspect every one. Similarly, when we think about knowledge, the ability to analyze documents and spot issues and the like, we see a real prospect increasingly for having certain paralegal tasks assumed by automation. So these are among the jobs that probably are going to become fewer in number in the coming years. Now, on the other side of the scale, there's other things to consider. When you start to apply that same analytical approach, it becomes apparent that some jobs really cannot be replaced by AI. And they more fundamentally relate to human ingenuity, human creativity, and perhaps most important of all, human empathy and human interaction. So nurses, I think, are in good shape. Social workers, therapists, teachers. These are much more likely to be people who will use AI than be replaced by it. And it helps us understand a little bit, too, of how we can think about AI helping people, serving people, and even helping people grow certain jobs and become more valuable and effective and find enriching time in lives in what they do. And that leads to two other questions. The first is, how can AI empower people in new ways? Well, the first thing to really think about, I think the thing that I personally believe is the single most exciting thing for the next 5 years is what AI can do for people who have a disability. Because think about what vision can do for people who have blindness, some level of visual impairment. The computer can see and recognize an image and help inform someone. Think about the various issues relating to neurodiversity. Think about what it means for somebody who has dyslexia or autism or ADHD. The ability for computers to be able to look and recognize what is going on and advise people on what their facial recognition, what their facial image says. Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they concerned? It's a valuable tool. Think about what speech recognition means for people who have some level of deafness. Or think about what the various ways that computers can manage knowledge and what that can do for people who have a variety of different mental health issues. Just to get your mind around this a little bit, I want to show you a short video clip of what we're doing as we think about and move forward the technology that is being used with AI to address the needs of people who have some level of blindness.
Seeing AI is a Microsoft research project for people with visual impairments. The app narrates the world around you by turning the visual world into an audible experience. Point your phone's camera, select a channel, and hear a description. The app recognizes saved friends.
Jenny near top right, 3 feet away.
Describes the people around you, including their emotions.
28-year-old female wearing glasses looking happy.
It reads text out loud as it comes into view, like on an envelope.
Ken Lawrence, P.O. Box.
Or a room entrance.
Conference 2005.
Or scan and read documents like books and letters. The app will guide you and recognize the text with its formatting.
Top and left edge is not visible. Hold steady. Lease agreement. This agreement.
When paying with cash, the app identifies currency bills.
$20 US.
When looking for something in your pantry or at the store, use the barcode scanner with audio cues to help you find what you want.
Campbell's tomato soup.
When available, hear additional product details.
Heathen microwave bowl on hot.
And even hear descriptions of images in other apps like Twitter by importing them into Seeing AI.
A close-up of Bill Gates.
Finally, explore our experimental features like scene descriptions to get a glimpse of the future.
I think it's a young girl throwing a frisbee in the park.
Experience the world around you with the Seeing AI app from Microsoft.
What's exciting is what this can do for people. And what's exciting is that it was a group of young people who really first developed this project in a hackathon. It was released as a product just last July. It's already been used over 3 million times in terms of different tasks. So we're accumulating data that will just make it better and smarter as we go forward. But for people who have blindness, you can look at this and you can say, this can be a game changer. It's exciting to see. Ultimately, we need to ask some other questions as well. What jobs will AI create? Well, the truth is it's a lot easier to identify the jobs that AI will replace than the jobs that it will create. That's always true. Many studies have now suggested that for people who are starting in kindergarten today, by the time they graduate from high school, 65% of the jobs in the economy will be jobs that do not currently exist. Now, that may happen, it may not. I think it's a little hard to get down to that level of single-digit precision. But it is so clear that a number of new jobs will come into existence. And there are some interesting ways to think about these new jobs. Some will clearly be in the disciplines that are required to make AI work. After all, if AI is exploding, the people who can work with AI are going to have a bright future in terms of jobs. And of course, that causes one to start where you would expect. Computer science and data science, the two fields that are just foundational for AI. But it's really interesting, I think, to think beyond that, to think about some of the pressing issues that will just become of paramount importance that companies that create AI will need to address. And that starts to bring us into the field of ethics. One of the things we thought about when we put this book together is that ultimately the question is not what computers can do, it's what computers should do. That is really one of the great questions of our time. And in effect, what it should inspire us to do is really think about the ethics of AI. What does this require? Well, in the book, we really thought about 6 different fields that we see coming together. Some of them exist today, but some of them are just in their infancy. If you look at the 6 ethical areas, and you look in the middle and the top, there are 2 fields that are really well developed already: reliability and safety. If you look at ethics or law, it was really created by the world's transition to the automobile. And when you look at privacy and security, it was really created by the world's transition to information technology. But in both places, there are strong principles that one can now apply to AI. But on both sides of that, there are issues that will be of huge importance and deliver great fertile ground for discussion. One is fairness. If we're going to entrust computers to make decisions, how do we ensure that they're made fairly? What we've already learned is that if you have a data set that has bias in the data that was selected, then the algorithm will not be able easily to solve for that. So there will be a huge amount of focus and learning and discussion around what it takes to ensure that computers don't discriminate in ways that we would find unacceptable or unlawful. And similarly, because of the impact of AI on inclusiveness, on people with disabilities, is going to be so profound, it will either make people's lives better, or if we don't think about these needs, it will hold these people back. This too will be of huge importance. And then there's two issues that underlie all the rest. One is transparency. If the world doesn't have some reasonable way to know what AI is doing, then it actually has no way to evaluate those four issues on the top. And that probably doesn't mean that every algorithm should be published for all kinds of reasons, including most will be incomprehensible to most people virtually all the time. But there's a huge focus on what it will take to make AI explainable so that people can understand how it's working and thereby evaluate it. And then ultimately, to me, the most important, the reason it is the foundation for everything else, the reason I believe it is one of the most important questions of our time, is how do we ensure accountability? Will we ensure that machines remain accountable to people? Will we ensure that the people who design these machines remain accountable to other people? Only if we address both of those questions and find answers that ensure accountability can we have the kinds of confidence that we need to have in where the future is going. But I will say, as somebody who deals with a lot of the real-world questions that arise out of this, those six put together are not sufficient. We probably need to talk in the future about what a Hippocratic oath for AI developers would mean. What does it take to ensure that AI will do no harm? What does it take to train a new generation of people so that they can work on AI with that kind of commitment and principle in mind? And one should never think that this is just a question that is going to need to be thought about by people who happen to work at some large tech companies. Because given where AI is going, especially given the kind of approach that we're taking as a company, it's all about ensuring that anybody can build an AI solution. We're creating building blocks, the vision building blocks, the speech building blocks, and the like, so that other people, companies, governments, universities, individuals can take them and create their own AI solutions. It's a wonderful thing, but it means that AI ethics are not just for a few people. They're for almost every part of society. If we're going to remain true to what I think we would typically say are timeless values, we also need to recognize one other question. Do we want only ethical people to behave ethically, or would we like everyone to behave ethically? Well, to some degree, that is the question that every government has to ask when it decides whether it wants to pass a law. And while we don't pass a law in every field of ethics, we do pass laws in many fields. And so ultimately, this is going to create new questions for issues of public policy and the evolution of the law. It's why we concluded as we wrote this book that in many ways, skilling up for this future isn't only about science, technology, engineering, and math. It's not only about computer science and data science. It's actually about the humanities. It's about the social scientists. I think we're going to see a decade from now many more people working in tech companies and many more people working on technology that come out of the liberal arts. Already we see this at Microsoft. It's why it was really interesting to put this book together for me, who came from the liberal arts side of Microsoft, and Harry Shum, who co-authored the foreword with me, who got a PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon after growing up in China. More and more often, it takes both of us to find the right answers. It also just reminds us of why diversity is such an imperative for the future of technology. Because given where all of this is going, and given the risk of bias creeping into AI systems and data sets, it makes it all the more important that we have a diverse group of people working in our industry. Then there's the last thing I want to share, and in some ways I think this is one of the most intriguing, and certainly if one wants to end on a more optimistic note, I think it's quite fascinating. What are the disciplines that AI can make more impactful? Well, the truth is, almost Any. Because as we look at where AI is going, it is changing healthcare. It will play a fundamental role in the cures for cancer. It is changing our agriculture. The future of farming is really precision farming with IoT devices and broadband connections and AI systems to help farmers know what to plant, when, and where. As you've seen, the future of accessibility is going to be influenced by AI, and even the protection of the planet is going to be impacted by this. And two examples really bring this to life. One is right here on the Princeton campus. There's this wonderful work going on in the Department of Near Eastern Studies. It's called the Princeton Geniza Lab. And one of the real leaders in using AI in this field is a Princeton professor, Marina Rustow. Now, it turns out that the Princeton Geniza Lab is at the forefront of the analysis of a very large number of Middle Eastern documents that were written between 700 and 1500 AD. They work with these documentary fragments. Oftentimes, they only have half a document. It turns out that these documents were written, in this case, in Egypt, and in 1897, there were over 200,000 fragments that left Egypt, and they went to Cambridge, and they ultimately scattered in many cases around the world, including here at Princeton, which is one of the world's great repositories of learning and even the collection of these documents. Well, here's a very interesting half a document that Professor Rustow was working on. It tells a tantalizing tale of a situation in Cairo where a Jewish member of a synagogue brought a lawsuit in an Islamic court to contest the fact that he had in fact been thrown out of the synagogue. But the problem was it was only half a document. You couldn't tell when this happened. Well, this is where technology has made a fascinating difference. Because over time, these images have been copied, digitally stored, and AI is being put to use. A team in Israel developed different algorithms to try to identify how these documents might be joined, the technical term for how they come together. And they recognized that because the tears in paper changed over time, you couldn't just look at where paper would match, although that would be a standard case of vision recognition that I described before. Instead, they developed algorithms that did even more than that. They looked at the density of the text on a page, the distribution of writing on a page. And then they made a lot of these algorithms and these techniques available. Well, it turns out that Professor Rustow was able to access this, and what she was able to do was use an algorithm, use AI to find a match. And suddenly this question that had been imponderable, when was this document written, became clear. It was written, it turns out, in 1463. Who would have thought that artificial intelligence would transform the study of documents written in the 15th century? But it is yet another example of what you see happening across the Princeton campus in academic departments. It is making every field better. And I think that's exciting. And what it reminds us is, as I was saying before, engineering isn't only for the engineers anymore. It really underscores the fact that everybody who is in the liberal arts can benefit from learning a little bit of computer science and data science, and every engineer is going to probably need some more liberal arts in their future. And if you have any doubt about that, you can consider this other example. It's what AI can do for environmental science, for what it can do for the future of the planet. At Microsoft, we've created a program, a $50 million program we call AI for Earth. And it focuses on providing seed grants to startups and universities in 4 areas. Climate, which is really around carbon, as well as around issues of water, agriculture, and biodiversity. And as we do this work, we then identify projects that have promise, and we put more money behind them. And we bring together people who are great experts in environmental science, and we give them more training and tools relating to AI. We believe this can be a game changer as we all work on the future of the planet. And it is starting to have an impact around the world, as you see here in this short video that literally covers the planet.
Hydro is a hydropower company located in the south of Norway. We have been basically running the same operation for decades.
The fourth industrial revolution is about connecting things together. We now can collect data from millions of sensors in our systems, in our grid, in our production, and we can use this data to make new products, take decisions, and manage our business.
The Smart Grid pilot program that we did with Microsoft was looking into the grid and see how could we use new technology to operate the grid in a new way. And what we found was that we could actually interact with the customers in order to reduce the load on specific components in the grid. We need to be prepared for what's coming, and to do that we would need better tools than we have today, and that has to be based on artificial intelligence.
Singapore is a very warm climate country, and TTC has a lot of buildings. With air conditioning, your cost is very, very high.
JOPS is an Internet of Things system that seeks to leverage technology, gather all the building data, do some analysis, and ensure that our buildings are efficient. Within this project, we are able to achieve 15% in energy cost avoidance. We also saw an improvement of 15% for productivity.
I think as a government agency, we set the tone. We believe in environmental sustainability.
The purpose of the yield is to feed the world without wrecking the planet. We use real-time weather data at the farm, and then it goes into Microsoft's Azure cloud, where we apply our machine learning that help growers know when to plant, when to irrigate, and when to harvest. Houston's Farm estimate that they save 30% of their irrigation costs and water losses through using our technology. Climate change is making weather more and more unpredictable. We can't control Mother Nature, but we can use technology to help understand her moods.
I think that gives us a glimpse of what it means to prepare for this kind of future, an AI-powered future. And it gives us some glimpse of the impact we may see on jobs and the like. But what it also really tells us is where we're going to need to do more work, where we may need, in effect, a new social contract, if you will, because people are going to need to learn new skills. There are going to need to be new career pathways for people whose jobs are displaced. We're going to need to think about the kinds of labor rules and protections that were created in the economy of the 20th century, and we're going to need to change them for the jobs of tomorrow. We're even going to need to think about the social safety net as these changes ripple throughout the economy. All of that will be important. But there's one last thing that I would leave you with as well, especially for the students in the room. Every time I talk with new people who join Microsoft, I like to remind them that when they got a job description. It described the job they were hired to do. But as I always like to point out to people, the job description defines where your job begins. You get to define where your job ends. You get to decide where you take initiative and move things forward. And fundamentally, what I believe is true for an individual is true for a generation. Because if you look at what the world needs, and then look at what AI has to offer, it will take a generation of new people that can take what we know today and do far more with it than we even today currently can imagine. But that, I believe, is an exciting future. And I think we have a generation that's coming out of Princeton and other places that can seize that challenge and make that future real. So thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone, and then you can ask.
Excellent presentation. You didn't really touch on what I would call the more not opportunistic things that are going to come. I'd like your comments or thoughts on universal basic income. Do you think that's going to be necessary? What is going to happen to, say, truck drivers, cashiers, jobs that are kind of high school graduate type things? The pathway that these people will have is going to be very limited, either by economic reasons that they can't, in the middle of their life, 40, 45, 50 years old, to retrain. Who would pay for that? Do they have the intellectual capacity to do a higher tech job? I think these are going to be displaced people. I'm a social and economic historian. I just love the presentation that you did about the recession. Most people don't know that. The future may not have the opportunities that we did coming out of the 30s. The failure of the farms back then had an environmental anomaly, we would call it. We are going to also have a bigger one coming with climate change that you'll have to deal with. But I see a great political, social, and economic crisis coming within 20 years. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Sure. No, thank you. First of all, I think you raised what are frankly a number of profound questions. And the first thing I would point out is, to some degree, the future has already arrived in the following. Consider this. Between 1989 and 2016, the number of jobs in the United States held by somebody with a 4-year college degree or greater went up by 107%. It more than doubled. And the path was almost completely linear, meaning it didn't actually matter whether there was a Democrat or Republican in the White House or controlling Congress. This country has been sort of an economic machine in creating jobs that college graduates could hold. But then think about the group that you just mentioned. Think about people who only have a high school diploma or less. Between 1989 and 2016, that number actually fell by 13%. There were 7.3 million fewer jobs in the country for people who had that level of education. So you look at this and you say, that is clearly going to continue. In fact, it may even diverge to a greater degree. What are we going to do? And I think initially there are two things that we have to focus on, and then there's more to follow. The first is the skills gap. How do we equip people with the new skills they will need? Now, to some degree, it's digital skills, but it's lots of other skills as well. And I think there's just a new generation of challenges for the workforce development boards across the country, for the community colleges across the country, for technology companies like Microsoft that owns LinkedIn, where technology can help people acquire new skills and get connected with new jobs. So that skills gap is just a much bigger issue than it was before. Then there's a second issue that I personally believe is getting far too little attention in the country, and that's the broadband gap. There are at least 25 million Americans that have no access to broadband. Most of them live in rural counties. And the truth is, it doesn't matter. You can take anything I've shown, including Netflix, and if you don't have access to broadband, you're just reading about something that somebody else gets to live with. It actually doesn't help improve your life. And so just as we brought telephone service to every person in America, just as we brought electricity to every person in America, if we're going to enable everybody to move forward, we are going to need to bring broadband to everyone, everywhere. And it's going to require a combination of market innovation and public policy. And then there is the big question that you also posed. That's great. Let's say we make great progress on the skills gap and on the broadband gap. Will there still be some people who do not have it in them to be able to succeed? This is where we are going to have to think about the social contract, about what it means for the social safety net. I probably wouldn't myself run towards a universal, basic income as the answer, but I do think we fundamentally need to ask about where the social safety net is going. And just one of the many questions we have to consider today is that much of our social safety net is paid in by people who are called employees who make contributions matched by entities called employers. But an Uber driver's not an employee, and Uber's not an employer because that person's called an independent contractor. And as this economy continues to shift, as we have people doing more work digitally, we're going to, in my view, need to create some new 21st century job categories, or we're just not going to have the money flowing in to be able to construct a social safety net that is strong as the country's going to need. So all of these are very big questions. Yeah, no, I agree. Well, I'll just say one more thing. I know there's other questions. If you look at the transition from the horse to the automobile, and you look at over 40 years, it all ended well. But if you look at it at the midpoint, life was pretty challenging. The 1930s were not an easy decade. And so it's a very powerful reminder of the importance of addressing these disruptions that could come that I mentioned.
The woman in the white coat.
Speaking of education, how do you think AI will affect or impact education going forward?
I'm sorry, affect what?
How do you think AI will impact or affect education going forward?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to say that I can predict how it's going to affect every field, but I do think that you can think about AI in two different ways. One is what it will mean for learning, and the other is what it will do for teaching. Certainly for learning, everything that is done that involves sort of reading, for example, or studying, AI can be a very powerful assistant, I believe. And so it can be a tool to help students probably at all levels. And you can imagine education for kids, including for students in college, really benefiting from what will probably be almost a panoply of different AI tools. Now, some of this actually will have special application for students with disabilities, but I think for everyone, when you look at the machine learning capabilities, that's where what we're just seeing, frankly, just in terms of improvements in search and the like, we'll see that it can provide new learning tools. I think AI also offers some potentially interesting new resources for teachers. Bill Gates has long spoken about a number of education issues, and teaching is so interesting because as a teacher, one spends a lot of time giving feedback to others, but a teacher doesn't always have as much opportunity to get feedback from others because the teacher is the only adult in a room, in a public classroom, for example. But I think AI can be a tool that teachers may find useful to, in effect, bring with them into the classroom and even be their assistant, if you will, to help identify what's going on, analyze what's happening in terms of test results, discern patterns and trends, and offer suggestions to teachers that can make them more effective. So I think we're in early days, but you just think about these educational fields, AI, I think, is going to be quite impactful.
Here, the gentleman with the mustache.
In ethics, it seems to me that the problem is less often good and evil, but conflicting goods. So I'm wondering, do you see diversity as an obstacle to achieving values? It seems to me very hard to identify what are values that everybody would hold, particularly in our society now. The other part of my question is transparency. How do you achieve transparency when you can't even tell the way neural networks reach conclusions? Nobody can tell.
You've just identified 2 or 3 of, frankly, some of the most fundamental issues that one will need to grapple with when it comes to AI. The first is what I would call diversity. There will always be divergences in what people value, but I do believe that a diverse group of computer scientists and data scientists is going to be better able to identify where bias has crept into a data set. Because the fundamental, one of the fundamental contributors to say bias in AI is a data set that is itself unrepresentative. And so I think diverse groups will be better at being able to work together and identify that. So that's one piece of it. The second piece really does go to this very difficult issue around transparency. I think we need to sign up for transparency as a fundamental ethical principle and even need for AI that is societally responsible. Then the question becomes, great, how do we do that? And what we're seeing in the early days is a lot of debate. Some people say, well, just make the data set available to everybody. Others say, well, just make the algorithm available to everybody. Ultimately, the term of the year is make it explainable to everybody. In other words, explain how this algorithm is working and how it is making decisions. Now, you're right. It's like, wait a second. When we're talking about deep neural nets, I wish we knew. There are some aspects that can be quite challenging. But what I would say is this. I mean, I think sometimes, especially when you see the world of computing sort of collide with the world of values and ethics and policy and law, it's very easy to get stuck by talking exclusively about what we do not yet know how to do. I think we need to start by doing what we do know how to do. And so what I would advocate is that we start to take steps to develop standards around explainability, that companies start to implement those steps, and then we'll all learn. We'll get smarter together, and we may solve 90% of the problems, and then we can devote our energy to the last 10. I just think that's likely to be a far more productive path than just debating the, what we like to call in computing, edge cases, the hardest cases, frankly, the cases that may be impossible to solve.
Hey, thank you for coming today. And just was wondering what your thoughts are where AI is going to go with our military and our law enforcement. Will that just enhance it, or i.e., or replace some Robo-Joe or Robo-Cop, or how far off is that?
I think there's 2 very different questions when you think about law enforcement and military applications of AI and put them together. And I'll just capture 2, and I'm sure other people who know more than me would say, oh, there's really 6 or 8, but I can at least give you 2. The first is giving people information about what is going on. And it can be tremendously helpful, for example, for troops before they enter a battle. That there is just so much more data that is coming back today, and then the ability to use, in effect, what is vision recognition and machine learning to enable troops to know what to expect before they go into an area for a battle. It does, I believe, have the potential to really fundamentally transform, at least say, ground combat over the next decade. And what we're really probably going to see in that space is this combination of more real-time data, large data sets, and then what we call augmented reality. The ability for people to wear goggles or glasses as they go into battle and have information displayed so that if they're in an Iraqi town, before going into a building and opening the door, they can much more likely discern what is most likely behind the door. But there's another part to that when you start to take that same technology and apply it to law enforcement that also raises one of, I think, the most important ethical questions. Because if you want to keep the public safe from crime or terrorism, you can put cameras everywhere. You can build facial recognition into all these cameras. The New York Times actually had a long story about this just yesterday. And you can go a lot farther than most parts of the world have in identifying where individuals are, what they're doing, and frankly, fighting crime and combating terrorism. This is probably done more broadly in the City of London than any city in the world. But if you're an authoritarian regime, you can also use that ability to engage in effect, mass surveillance, coupled with this enormous amount of data, to stop people from exercising what I'll suspect all of us in this room would regard, frankly, as fundamental human rights. And this gets back to this question that was posed before. Different people have different values. And there are huge questions, I believe, about where different parts of the world are going to go. How are they going to use AI? And are there global norms around human rights that the world is going to want to adopt, at least in principle, even if they're not prepared to sign up for it in practice? All of this will be huge. The other thing I'll just mention more briefly is, of course, there are issues when it comes to AI and weapons. Already we may well have entered a period of time when all future planes that are purchased by the United States Air Force will be purchased with a design that has no seat for a pilot. What do we do then to enable the machine that is piloting that plane to make decisions on its own? This is where the accountability issue, I think in some ways, is even more important for AI applications in military combat than perhaps anywhere else. And it's frankly one of the reasons I think the accountability principle just needs to be a bedrock principle in every part of society, so that we don't wake up someday and find that we have entrusted machines with the ability to make decisions that frankly horrify us. We've got to avoid that kind of outcome.
Al, the woman in the purple. If you could wait for the mic, please.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic in terms of how the laws are going to change versus the technology will change? And what makes you one way or another?
I think one of the great questions of the day is, is one an optimist or a pessimist about where all this is going? And first of all, if you work in the tech sector, you must be an optimist. It's almost a job requirement. And there are so many causes for optimism. I think that when you look at what this technology can do to help us solve fundamental societal and even global challenges, it's a game changer in so many ways. But I will say, but we have to be realistic. And frankly, part of being realistic is to fully expect something that has happened for 250 years in a consistent way. I always like to point out, Benjamin Franklin invented the post office, and then criminals invented mail fraud. Hey, we can use these letters to defraud people. In the 1800s, people invented the telegraph, and then the telephone, and then criminals invented wire fraud. And then people invented the internet, and criminals invented internet fraud. And we struggle, and we have always struggled with new technology about both what individuals did with it, that we decided as a society and really on a global basis was unlawful, and therefore even in certain circumstances criminal. And we have also struggled with new technology in terms of what nation states, governments, countries did with the technology. So while I am optimistic, I think it's really important to be a little bit sober. And that whenever I perhaps need a little dose of extra sobriety, I turn back to this incredible statement that Albert Einstein made in the 1930s. After the Japanese invaded Manchuria and there was this horrible war first erupting across Asia, before anybody even saw it quite happening in Europe, there was a peace conference in Geneva at the League of Nations, and it fell apart. It collapsed. And what Einstein said was that between the mid-1800s and the mid-1900s, humanity's organizing ability had not kept pace with humanity's ingenuity when it came to new technology. And so I actually think that in some ways, the most sober question for all of us is, can we do better in the 21st century than the world did a century ago? Or will we have to go through some other calamity before we wake up and do what the world requires? And when we look at issues like cybersecurity and nation-state attacks and how cyber weapons are being used in new ways, I frankly think that even as we embrace all these exciting things, we do need to wake up. And I don't think we're quite fully awake. If we wake up a little bit more, then I'll be even more optimistic, is what I would say.
That seems like an excellent point to close. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice meeting you.